Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Chip Fletcher. He is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology, University of Hawaii, Manoa. He is a commissioner on the Honolulu Climate Change Commission. He has been principal advisor in funding and awarding over 30 graduate research degrees and has received a number of teaching, research, and community service awards. Chip also has a textbook on climate change, and it's in its second edition, published by J. Wiley & Sons, titled Climate Change, What the Science Tells Us. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Chip Fletcher.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, everybody, for spending a little bit of your Saturday morning with us. Let me share my screen, and we can get started. I want to talk about not just climate change, but some parallel planetary emergencies that are occurring as well that integrate with climate change, biodiversity loss, the spread of pathogenic disease, and how these work together to increase human inequality across the planet. But first, let's take a quick review of the greenhouse effect, which is the sort of the background process that is driving climate change and amplifying these other problems. Sunlight enters Earth's atmosphere, and where it encounters a bright white surface, such as this sea ice in the Arctic, it will be wholly or partially reflected back out to space and won't be involved in any warming. But where sunlight intersects a dark surface, such as open water or the land, or even vegetated canopy, it will be partially absorbed. It will warm up that dark surface, and then that surface will re-radiate the energy out as heat in a different set of frequencies. And surrounding the lowest layer of the atmosphere, called the troposphere, are a set of greenhouse gases which will trap this heat and then re-radiate it in all directions, some of which is back down to Earth's surface and heating it a second time. And the more of these greenhouse gases that accumulate in the troposphere, the more this reheating effect, or the greenhouse effect, takes place. Now, these gases include methane, nitrous oxide, various fluorocarbons, and we're also seeing a slow reduction in aerosols associated with fossil fuel burning. These aerosols are small particles in the atmosphere that reflect sunlight and provide a cooling function. But as we convert more and more to non-fossil fuel forms of energy, these aerosols are washing out of the atmosphere and their cooling effect is being removed. So they are an additional heating element, if you will. Carbon dioxide is estimated to be responsible for about 70% of the anthropogenic global warming effect. But once you warm air, it becomes more humid. We're all familiar with that. And in fact, water vapor is the most powerful greenhouse gas. And measuring the entire greenhouse effect, the total greenhouse effect, not just the anthropogenic warming, water vapor is responsible for anywhere from 36 to 70% of this. So as the air over the Arctic warms, we see a retreat of the sea ice, the exposure of warm or of dark ocean surface, which absorbs solar radiation and then gets involved in releasing heat and triggering this whole effect. Summer sea ice has declined 50% since 1980. And the oldest and thickest ice, which is located over here north of Alaska, has declined fully 95%. Now note that Greenland is here in the Arctic Circle and participating and being exposed to this rapidly warming area. In fact, there is an amplifying feedback effect which takes place in the Arctic. Temperatures are rising because of human emissions of fossil fuels and also certain land use practices that we'll get into later. Those temperatures will reduce the amount of Arctic sea ice in the summer. We see a larger expanse of dark ocean then that absorbs more solar radiation and releases yet more heat. And then this feeds back into the cycle as temperatures rise. In fact, the Greenland ice sheet, which is one of 2 continental scale ice sheets on the planet, is experiencing accelerated melting. One of the effects that's taking place is that the ash from wildfire and also from volcanic eruptions that had been largely buried in the snow and ice accumulating over centuries is being concentrated as the ice melts and runs off as water. We see these dark particles, these forms of ash building up. And so the surface of the Greenland ice sheet is actually getting darker and absorbing more sunlight because of that. And these ashes are degrading, they are chemically weathering, and they are releasing nutrients on the ice surface and actually feeding the growth of bacteria, which are adding to the darkening of the Greenland ice sheet. So Greenland is losing ice at an increasingly rapid rate. This is the record of mass loss on Greenland as measured by satellite. The melting on Greenland has quadrupled in the last decade, and Greenland is contributing a little more than about a quarter to global mean sea level rise. It's losing on the order of 280 billion tons of mass, which is ice, per year. So this has a set of additional effects that are planetary in scale. So what we're looking at here is temperature change on the planet relative to the global average. And we see that continents are warming faster than oceans. In fact, in the summertime, there are several places on the northern hemisphere where continental heating is reaching 4 degrees Celsius above what the natural level would be. This high level of warming during the summertime is fueling wildfires, and it is putting at risk the world's bread baskets and the world's communities. And we also see here the dark red colors in the Arctic. This is Arctic amplification. The Arctic is warming faster than the global average. And Greenland, in accelerating its melting, is spilling fresh water into the North Atlantic. And you can see this cold spot there in the North Atlantic. In fact, the temperatures in the North Atlantic are the coldest they've been since Ben Franklin used to sail back and forth between Europe and the United States and the colonies, I guess, at that time. And this cold water is fresh water coming off of Greenland, and it is decreasing an important current system, which is called the conveyor belt. This conveyor belt is a global scale current, and in the Atlantic, it brings heat in from the Indian Ocean, from the South Atlantic, and carries it up into the North Atlantic. The current then overturns down into the deeper water column and releases the heat in the process, making Northern Europe much warmer than it would be otherwise. But this circulation system has slowed. And one of the results of this is that we see these red indicators down here in the South Atlantic. Heat is building up in the South Atlantic, in the Southern Ocean, and it's actually leading to an acceleration of Antarctic ice melting. And melting on Antarctica has tripled since 2010. In fact, it's responsible for about 14% of global mean sea level rise. And there's a set of glaciers here in that extremely dark area. This is the West Antarctic region. There are outlet glaciers. Two of them are named the Pine Island Glacier and Thwaites Glacier. These are considered the most dangerous ice bodies in the world. They appear already to be in a state of irreversible retreat. And we are greatly worried about the possibility of especially the Thwaites Glacier experiencing a catastrophic collapse into the sea. I'm not describing something that's going to happen in the space of a few days. I'm describing something that's going to take place over decades and centuries, but at an accelerated rate. Should this happen, we would possibly see multi-meter sea level rise this century. But Arctic amplification has effects in the atmosphere as well. So the tropics receive excess sunlight, and this heat needs to be removed from the tropics. In fact, there's a set of circulation cells you see here in the atmosphere that carry heat from the tropics towards the poles. And as the Arctic warms faster than the tropics, the temperature difference decreases. And that gradient, that temperature difference, which drives the energy of atmospheric circulation, is leading to slower atmospheric circulation. And as air flows towards the Arctic, especially, it will turn under the Coriolis force created by the spin of the Earth and become a high elevation river of wind known as the jet stream. And the jet stream under natural circumstances is a rapidly flowing, fairly linear body of air. But as Arctic amplification slows atmospheric circulation, the jet stream slows and it develops these instabilities, these large waves. These waves will pull Arctic air down to the south and pull tropical air up to the north. So as a result, we see the formation of record-setting heat waves where one of these jet stream waves is pulling up tropical air. And this extreme weather event, this heat wave, tends to linger and last longer than historically because the jet stream itself is slower. And we will see record-setting cold and snow where one of these meanders pulls down Arctic air. The result of this is that we're seeing extreme weather increasing on the planet, and global weather disasters, in fact, have tripled just in the last 2 decades. This is a record in the US of weather disasters, each of which caused $1 billion in damage. And the record begins back in 1980. You can see that there's been a clear increase in the number of these billion-dollar disasters. And last year, 2020, was a record-setting year with 22 separate billion-dollar disasters. The previous record was 16. This year, 2020, we saw $95 billion in damages, and accumulating since 1980, we're at about $2 trillion in damage because of these extreme weather events. And these include drought, record-setting freezes, tropical cyclones, wildfire, etc. So climate change has a number of effects that are very concerning and expensive for human society. We know that sea level is rising, and we're now committed to centuries of sea level rise. Extreme weather disasters are on the rise. Insured losses have tripled in 20 years. And Swiss Re, the insurance giant, issued a report just last week in which they say, as crop yields fall, disease spreads, and rising seas consume coastal cities, rising temperatures are likely to reduce global wealth significantly by 2050, and they peg that number at $23 trillion. These processes lead to food and water insecurity. Rising drought, storminess, and heat reduce the reliance or the reliability or resilience, if you will, of food and water sources. We know that since the 1960s, globally, farming productivity has declined by a fifth, by 21%. And it turns out that as CO2 in the air rises, the four main cereals providing human food, rice, wheat, soy, and corn, actually see a reduction in their nutritional value. We see a reduction in iron, zinc, vitamin B complex, and we see a reduction in protein content being replaced by carbohydrates. Heat beyond human tolerance is growing. Models project that 600 million people just in the Middle East and North Africa will be exposed to weeks of excessively high temperatures exceeding 133 degrees Fahrenheit. And today we have intolerable conditions for human communities on about 0.8% of the land surface. This is largely in the center of the Sahara Desert and the shores of the Red Sea. But continued emissions are projected to increase this to almost 1/5 of global land surface within the next 50 years. That, of course, will be driving human communities out of their current locations and driving them to seek new homelands. This human displacement, in fact, has significant ramifications. There is a climate component behind the migration in the Americas up to the Mexican-US border. And there is a climate component which is driving the movement of Syrians into the European Union. And in fact, which 5 years or so formed the basis for the collapse of the farming economy in Syria, and through several steps, realizing the corruption of the President Assad regime, the occurrence of a civil war, and eventually spawning the creation of ISIS. It's being projected now that for every 1 degree Celsius of additional global warming, we'll be displacing about 1 billion people. Now, the ecosystem is suffering as well. The oceans are hotter, they're more acidic, and dissolved oxygen in the oceans is declining. And the maximum temperature of marine heat waves is projected to increase about 10-fold as greenhouse gas emissions continue. Within just a few decades, it's been projected by several authors that coral reef ecosystems will be afflicted by increasing frequency of bleaching. Coral reef ecosystems, you can't just turn them on and off like a light switch. A bleaching event is devastating, and it's extremely difficult and takes many, many years for the ecosystem to recover, if in fact it does recover. And because of bleaching, we have a new phenomenon now, reef collapse, that was published in 2017 in this paper that's referenced on the bottom. This, in fact, is a photo of the reef seafloor off the north coast of Maui. As corals bleach and die, and we see an end to the mineral production of the corals, the crystallization that corals engage in to create their hard exoskeletons, which creates the hard substrate of the reef itself. As that ends with bleaching and the bioerodiers that are constantly at work bioeroding their way through that solid limestone, we see the bioerodiers really weaken the reef structure and lead to its collapse. This deepens the water close to the coastline, allowing more wave energy access to the coastline. And in fact, on land, we are seeing severe impacts as well. Everything in red and pink that you see here is landscape modified by humanity. And what you see here color-coded as wilderness is actually the Sahara, the deserts of Saudi Arabia, the permafrost zones of Siberia and northern Canada. And just in the last 2 decades, we've seen an area of ecologically intact land the size of Mexico completely lost, largely consisting of savanna and rainforests. This is an image of palm oil plantation in Indonesia. And overall, globally, 86% of all land mammals on Earth are now either livestock or humans. Of all birds, 70% are chickens and other poultry. Only 30% are wild. In 2020, the World Wildlife Foundation issued a report that found human activity, specifically overconsumption, population growth, and intensive farming, has destroyed 68% of vertebrate wildlife since 1970. Since 1970, food crop production has increased 300%, and half of all agriculture expansion has come at the expense of forests. We're deforesting the planet at the rate of 30 football fields per minute, largely to raise cattle and the grain to feed them. 43% of all ice and desert-free land, and 2/3 of all freshwater use is for food production for humanity. Over 80% of farmland is used for livestock, but it produces only 18% of food calories and just 37% of protein. Cattle and the grain they eat use 1/3 of available land surface on this planet, 16% of all available fresh water. 1/3 of worldwide grain production is to feed cattle. Producing beef, in fact, generates 100 times more greenhouse gas than plant-based food. And the ultimate drivers of this biotic destruction are human overpopulation, continued population growth, and overconsumption, especially by the rich. These drivers, all of which trace to the fiction that perpetual growth can occur on a finite planet, are themselves increasing rapidly. Scientists are now coming out with papers with remarkable titles, such as Earth entering its 6th mass extinction, biological annihilation. Has land use pushed terrestrial biodiversity beyond an irrecoverable boundary, approaching a fundamental state shift in Earth's biosphere? Marine defaunation, animal loss in the global ocean. Pervasive human-driven decline of life on Earth points to the need for transformative change. And this paper, a warning to humanity with over 15,000 co-authors, states that humans have pushed Earth's ecosystems to their breaking point and are well on the way to ruining the planet. These lead to the rise of pathogenic disease. 58% of all documented diseases have been aggravated by climate hazards. And the range of disease-carrying organisms, think mosquitoes, is expanding. People displaced by wildfire, storms, floods, and heat waves are pushed closer to pathogens during these extreme weather events. And warming increases the virulence of these pathogens. It increases the season length and the breeding and growing grounds available to them. Simultaneously, human immunity is impaired by malnutrition, growing heart disease, obesity, smoke inhalation related to wildfires and allergies, and other aspects of changes in the air related to climate change. Habitat loss, largely related to expansion of agriculture, fundamentally associated with the desire for a diet of beef, increases spillover events of diseases from animals into the human population. These diseases that come from other animals are known as zoonotic diseases. And 98% of the meat eaten in the United States comes from factory farming, where we cram dozens to thousands of animals into enclosed spaces. Disease spreads through these animals, and the dead and ill animals are removed and replaced with healthy animals. So natural processes associated with evolution lead to increased virulence of the diseases, where in nature, viruses, for instance, cannot afford to continuously kill their hosts. In these factory conditions, factory farming conditions, they can, and they become more and more pathogenic, more and more virulent. To maintain these animals, we keep them alive by pumping them with antibiotics, so much so that nearly 2/3 of all drugs important to human medicine in the United States are sold for this purpose. And overuse of these medicines drives the rise and spread of bacterial resistance. Disease, environmental damage, climate change, and human inequality form an amplifying feedback. Disadvantaged groups suffer disproportionately, which leads them to be further exposed with lowered resilience in the face of additional diseases or climate change hazards. This results in widening inequality between different social layers within human communities. In fact, the ratio between the income of the richest 10% and poorest 10% is 25% larger than it would be in a world without global warming. So these greenhouse gases are emitted from various nations. We know from a report by the Rhodium Group that came out earlier this week, total emissions in 2019 totaled 52 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The equivalent means that we're taking all the greenhouse gases that were emitted and normalizing them to the warming effects of carbon dioxide. This is a little bit over an 11% increase in emissions over the past decade. China is the largest emitter. They were the largest emitter in 2019, responsible for about 27% of the emissions. The US was second at about 11% of emissions. India and the EU at 6.5%. Indonesia, Russia, Brazil, and Japan between about 3.5% and 2% of the emissions. But if you look back through time, it's the US that is responsible for the cumulative growth of greenhouse gas emissions, about 25% of the cumulative carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So averaged over the last decade, about 86% of carbon dioxide was emitted through the burning of fossil fuels in various forms. And about 14% came from land use practices such as deforestation, but also poor soil management practices. The use of deep plowing and leaving soil open to the atmosphere turns over soil and exposes the carbon in the soil to the air where it oxidizes and turns fields of soil into actually a source of carbon dioxide. If we got away from this deep furrowing and if we used cover plants, we could turn our ag fields into actual sinks of carbon dioxide, and they can help us in pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. Of these two major sources of CO2, an average of 46% goes into the atmosphere. About 30% or so is taken up by the terrestrial biosphere through photosynthesis. And about 23% is dissolved in the ocean, leading to a decrease in pH and what's known as ocean acidification. However, this 1/3 taken up by the terrestrial biosphere is at risk. We now have a paper that has identified the possibility of the terrestrial biosphere carbon sequestration capacity decreasing within just a few decades. So plant photosynthesis removes CO2 from the air. Plants also engage in what's known as respiration, which releases CO2 to the air. Photosynthesis has a thermal maximum, and past that point, photosynthesis sharply declines while respiration continues to increase. And this degrades the ability of our land plant biome to remove CO2 from the air. With continued emissions and the warming that will come with them, the carbon uptake is estimated to be degraded by nearly 50% as early as 2040. So that 30% of CO2 removal by the terrestrial photosynthetic community could go down to 15% before mid-century. This effect is not taken into account by the Paris Climate Agreement, which is a legal document to which all the world's nations have signed on, requiring them to decrease their greenhouse gas emissions. And the level of commitment of pledges to decrease greenhouse gas emissions is quantified, and those numbers do not take this effect into account. So what is the Paris Agreement? It's a treaty in the United Nations that was agreed to in 2015 to stop global warming before it reaches 2 degrees Celsius above the natural level, the pre-industrial level, and to pursue efforts to end warming before it reaches 1.5 degrees Celsius. But a report came out in 2019 from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, specifically on the warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it told us that warming from this level of increased heat will persist for centuries to thousands of years. And we will see increases in global temperature, heat extremes, heavy precipitation, drought, sea level rise, species loss and extinction, oxygen loss from the ocean, increased acidity and heating of the water, reduced marine biodiversity, reduced fisheries and ecosystems, increased disease, storminess, economic damage, decreased food and water security, decreased human safety, and increased human inequality. And this report then drove a change in global attitudes towards global warming, where we now identify reaching 1.5 degrees C as the target of our greenhouse gas mitigation efforts. So this is the record of mean global temperature from the late 19th century, compared to the average temperature of the 20 years from 1880 to 1900. Last year, we saw a rise of 1.3 degrees Celsius, which tied 2016. In fact, the 6 warmest years on this record all occur in the past 6 years. And warming has been following a linear trend shown by the blue line since 1970, but the last 6 years have notably departed from that trend, and this departure can't be accounted for by natural variability. So the rate of warming is accelerating, and although interrupted by the recession, growth rates of the greenhouse gases driving global warming are increasing, not declining. This is the record of carbon dioxide measured from Mauna Loa. It begins in the late 1950s. At that time, averaged over the first several years of the record, CO2 was growing at about 0.8 parts per million per year, and averaged over the last decade, CO2 has been growing at 2.4 parts per million per year. So CO2 accumulation is accelerating as well. Energy consumption in 2019 came from coal and black, oil, and gas, and combined, these fossil fuels provided about 85% of global energy consumption. Nuclear power provided about 4.5% of energy consumption. And then hydroelectric and other non-fossil fuel sources of energy together constituted about 11% of global energy consumption. However, fossil fuel use in 2019, and again, we're seeing it this year in 2021, is accelerating faster than renewable fuel use. In fact, renewable energy, even though it's growing exponentially, this growth has been so far too slow to offset the growth in fossil energy consumption. The fact is that renewable energy is helping fossil fuels meet the demand for new energy, and that demand is largely coming from the developing world. Yes, last year, 2020, due to the recession, we saw roughly a 7% decrease in global emissions. But by December of last year, global emissions had recovered. And in fact, the emissions in December alone were already 2% higher than they were in December of 2019 prior to the recession. The International Energy Agency issued a report about a week and a half ago in which they stated that carbon emissions are set to soar in 2021 and become the second highest rate in history. Global economic output this year is expected to rebound more than 2% higher than in 2019, and demand for fossil fuels is set to grow significantly. Coal demand is projected to increase by 60%. This is more than all renewables combined. And emissions are projected to increase overall 5% this year, which reverses about 80% of the decrease last year. Emissions at the end of this year are projected to end up just a little over 1% below the emissions of 2019. And next year will be even stronger as air travel returns. Emerging economies, the developing world, is driving the demand for energy back above 2019 levels, and global energy-related CO2 emissions are headed for their second largest annual increase ever. The fact is that 13% of the planet's population, almost 1 billion people, still do not have access to electricity. They desperately need energy, and fossil fuels are often the only sources available to them. Recovery from the COVID recession has put the oil industry back in business. We see first quarter reports from this year as profits from Shell, Exxon, BP, Chevron, and others. This is the history of CO2 emissions in billions of tons per year since the middle of the 19th century. To stop warming per the Paris Agreement at 1.5 degrees C, our emissions need to drop to zero within 30 years. We get another 15 years if we are shooting for the 2-degree target. And on the way, we need to reduce emissions by half simply by the end of this decade. Then we will be stuck with the CO2 still in the air. So the third pillar of climate change recovery, so there's adaptation, there's mitigation. The third pillar is sequestration. And deploying a network of carbon sequestration infrastructure has not yet even begun. There are 6 emissions sectors we need to address. Electricity is responsible for roughly 25% of emissions. Food, agriculture, and various forms of land use, another 24% of emissions. Industrial activity, about 1/5 of emissions. Transportation, about 14% globally. Buildings constitute about 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's another 10%, largely in the form of what are known as fugitive emissions, largely methane escape. To achieve scaling back in these sectors, governments need to develop policies. Governments at this stage are going to be the most effective in scaling back emissions from these multiple sectors. The commercial world also needs to embrace a low carbon marketplace. And each of us, every part of society, has to experience and embrace transformational change. Nobody can be excluded. Consumers must buy the most efficient items available, fly less, drive less, and change our diets. There are many pathways to solving this problem. One of them, just for reference, includes decreasing emissions by half by 2030. Half of cars globally need to be electric, and that needs to be clean electricity. Coal use has to dive to 6% by the end of the decade. And every year we need to add roughly 5 times more solar power capacity than our best year, which was 2019. 1/3 to 1/2 of all buildings on this planet need to be retrofitted for green electricity or some other green form, and increased efficiency. And an ag revolution is needed. We have over 1 billion people that are obese and over 1 billion people that are malnourished and do not know where their next meal is going to come from. Our global food system is broken. Thousands of cement and steel factories and power plants and other existing energy infrastructure has to be replaced, renovated, or removed. And nature is our best ally in fighting climate change, restoring biodiversity loss, and increasing human health. In fact, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has stated that making peace with nature is the defining task of the 21st century. And with that, I will end, and we still have some time left for questions. So thank you very much for your attention.